in a bustling airport terminal. The steady hum of announcements and the shuffle of hurried footsteps filled the air. Among the crowd, a woman stood out. Olivia Barnes, in her early 30s, walked confidently through the chaos, her high heels clicking against the floor with a rhythmic precision that mirrored her steady composure. She wore a tailored navy suit, her briefcase held firmly in one hand as she checked her phone, glancing at the last few emails before her flight. Olivia wasn't a stranger to business travel. As a rising star in the tech industry, she had become accustomed to the luxury of first-class flights, exclusive lounges, and the quiet comfort that came with being a frequent flyer. But today, there was something in the air that felt off. She had a busy week ahead, meetings with top executives, product launch discussions, and the pressure to seal a high-profile deal. But she was used to the stress. She handled it well, always showing up in control and composed, her confidence never wavering. Her flight was on time, and as she approached the gate, she noticed a line had already formed. She didn't mind waiting. She was used to the routine. As she approached the check-in counter, a young woman in her mid-20s, Samantha, greeted her with a slightly strained smile. Samantha was new to the airline and had only been a flight attendant for a few months. Her uniform was crisply pressed, but her hands trembled slightly as she scanned Olivia's boarding pass. First class, Samantha muttered to herself, scanning the ticket with a touch of disbelief. Then, looking Olivia up and down, she raised an eyebrow. "Are you sure you're in the right line?" Olivia, taken aback by the remark, paused for a moment. "I believe so," she responded coolly, not allowing her annoyance to show. "I'm flying first class." Samantha's lips curled into a small, almost mocking smile, and she gestured toward the gate. "Well, I'll need to double-check the system," she said, her voice dripping with skepticism. Olivia's eyes narrowed slightly, her calm demeanor beginning to fray at the edges. "You've already scanned my boarding pass. Is there a problem?" Samantha didn't respond immediately. She tapped on the computer, her fingers faltering. The silence stretched on longer than it should have. Olivia could feel the eyes of the people around her shifting, the uncomfortable tension building. Samantha, seemingly trying to hide her discomfort, handed the boarding pass back, still with a smirk. "Everything looks fine," Samantha said with a forced sweetness, but there was an edge in her voice. "Enjoy your flight." As Olivia passed by, she heard a soft chuckle from Samantha's colleague, standing nearby. They exchanged a glance, clearly amused by the encounter. Olivia's eyes flickered toward them, but she said nothing. She could feel the weight of their stares on her back as she walked towards the jet bridge. She could hear the murmurs of other passengers as she walked down the corridor to the first-class cabin. Olivia had dealt with condescension before, people who assumed they could judge her based on her appearance or her age. But she was used to that. She had learned long ago to rise above it. The last thing she wanted was to escalate a situation with an inexperienced flight attendant. As she settled into her seat, the flight attendants began their final preparations for takeoff. The first-class cabin was a haven of quiet luxury. Olivia placed her briefcase under the seat in front of her and adjusted her jacket, preparing for the long flight ahead. But just as she thought the situation had been forgotten, Samantha approached again, this time with a tray of drinks. Her smile was back, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Can I see your boarding pass again, please?" she asked, her voice laced with forced politeness. Olivia's patience had worn thin. She looked up at Samantha, her gaze cold and composed. "You already checked it at the gate," she said evenly. "I'm sitting in my seat. What's the issue?" Samantha hesitated, then shrugged, her expression tight. "Just a routine check," she said, but there was no mistaking the doubt in her voice. Olivia's eyes narrowed. She had already recognized the game Samantha was playing. This wasn't about routine checks. It was about something more. Olivia wasn't the type to be intimidated or to back down when someone tried to undermine her. She had worked too hard to get where she was, and she wouldn't let someone's misguided assumptions affect her now. Before Olivia could respond, a voice from the other side of the cabin interrupted. "Excuse me, is everything all right here?" It was David Thompson, a senior lawyer who had been seated across from Olivia. He had observed the entire exchange from his seat, and his sharp eyes were now focused on Samantha. "I saw you check her pass earlier, and I just saw you ask for it again. Can you explain why?" Samantha's cheeks flushed a deep red as she stammered for a moment, caught off guard. I was just following procedure," she said quickly, though it was clear she was trying to regain control of the situation. David didn't let up. "That's interesting, because I've been flying for years, and I've never had my pass checked twice on the same flight. So what exactly are you doing?" The other passengers in the cabin were starting to take notice, and Olivia could sense the shift in the atmosphere. Samantha's confidence was crumbling. She had underestimated the wrong person, and now she was caught in the spotlight. Olivia didn't speak. She simply leaned back in her seat, a faint, knowing smile on her lips. She didn't need to say anything. The moment had already shifted, and while Samantha tried to salvage the situation, Olivia knew that this was only the beginning of a much bigger story. As the plane ascended into the sky, Olivia settled into her seat, adjusting her seatbelt and preparing for the flight ahead. The first-class cabin was quiet, filled mostly with other business travelers typing away on their laptops or reading through documents. The atmosphere was calm, a sanctuary of peace before the whirlwind of her work schedule would begin again. Olivia took out her phone and glanced at the meeting agenda for the day. She was in the middle of confirming details with her assistant when a soft voice interrupted her focus. "Excuse me, Mom, could I see your boarding pass again?" It was Samantha, the same flight attendant who had questioned her earlier. Olivia, already feeling a growing sense of frustration, looked up. Samantha stood next to her seat, holding a tray with pre-departure drinks, but there was a subtle shift in her posture, a small, almost imperceptible tension in her shoulders. "I already showed you my boarding pass when I boarded the plane," Olivia replied, her voice steady, but there was an edge to it now. "Is there something wrong?" Samantha hesitated for a second. "Just a routine check, ma'am. Sometimes the system has glitches, and I like to double-check," she said, her voice sweet, but filled with an insincerity that Olivia could feel. Olivia was getting increasingly irritated. She had worked with countless people in high-stress situations, negotiating deals and managing teams, but the way Samantha was acting seemed more like a personal attack than a professional check. Olivia knew the game. This wasn't about a malfunctioning system. This was about Samantha questioning her presence in the seat, about whether someone like Olivia belonged in first class. It was an unspoken prejudice, subtle but powerful, and Olivia wasn't going to let it slide. Before Olivia could respond, she heard a voice from across the cabin. "I think I can help here." It was David Thompson, the lawyer who had been seated across from Olivia earlier. His voice was sharp and direct, cutting through the tension. David stood up, adjusting his suit jacket, and walked over to Olivia's seat. "Is there a reason you're questioning this woman's boarding pass again?" David asked, his eyes locking onto Samantha. His tone was firm, commanding respect. Samantha's expression faltered. She had not expected to be called out in front of others, especially not by a seasoned lawyer. "I'm just making sure everything is in order, sir," she said, trying to sound calm. But there was no hiding the nervous tremor in her voice. David raised an eyebrow. "Really? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're doubting her presence in first class," he said, his voice dripping with disbelief. A murmur ran through the cabin. The other passengers were beginning to notice the uncomfortable exchange. The flight attendants, who had been standing nearby, shifted awkwardly, sensing that the situation was about to escalate. Olivia remained silent, watching the exchange unfold with a quiet sense of satisfaction. She didn't have to say a word. David was doing the heavy lifting for her. She had learned long ago that there was power in letting others do the talking. She had dealt with small-minded people before, and David's intervention showed that people were noticing what Samantha was doing. Samantha stood there, caught between the pressure of the moment and the realization that she had misjudged Olivia. The room was growing tense, and for the first time, Samantha seemed unsure of herself. David turned toward Olivia, his voice gentle. "I hope that clears things up," he said. Before walking back to his seat, he shot a disapproving look at Samantha as he passed. Olivia gave him a grateful smile. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft but genuine. Samantha, now flustered and embarrassed, hurried back down the aisle without a word. The tension that had filled the cabin began to dissipate, and the flight attendants quickly returned to their duties. But Olivia could feel the weight of their stares as she leaned back in her seat. She could sense that this was far from over. Samantha's behavior wasn't just an isolated incident. It was a reflection of something deeper. A sense of entitlement and superiority that some people felt they could wield over others. Olivia knew that this was more than a simple misunderstanding. Samantha had made an assumption about her, about who she was and where she belonged, and she had tried to assert control in a way that was both subtle and insidious. But Olivia wasn't going to let it slide. She wasn't going to back down. As the plane continued its journey, Olivia couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. She had dealt with people like Samantha before, those who made judgments based on appearances or status, but this time, she had a feeling that things were going to play out differently. Olivia wasn't just any passenger. She was someone with influence, someone who knew how to make her voice heard. As the flight continued, Olivia found herself lost in thought, reflecting on the situation. She had seen how quickly things could spiral out of control when people let their biases and prejudices shape their behavior. It was something she had always been aware of, but today, it had been brought to the forefront in a way that left her unsettled. She glanced around the cabin, noticing the subtle glances from other passengers. Some were pretending not to pay attention, but Olivia could feel their eyes on her, aware of what had just transpired. The lawyer had spoken up, and now everyone was watching. She wasn't used to being the center of attention, but she knew that this moment was important. This wasn't just about a flight attendant questioning her ticket. This was about the larger picture, about how people in power often get away with undermining others without consequence. Olivia took a deep breath, reminding herself to stay calm. She wasn't going to let this bother her. Not today. She had a deal to close, a future to secure, and she wasn't going to let anyone, least of all a flight attendant, make her question that. But just as she was about to turn her attention back to her phone, the intercom clicked on, and the voice of the captain came over the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We are reaching cruising altitude and expect a smooth flight from here on out. Flight attendants, please complete your final preparations for the flight." Olivia leaned back in her seat, the weight of the situation slowly lifting from her shoulders. She had handled it. She had stood her ground. And now it was over, or so she thought. As the hours passed on the flight, Olivia couldn't shake the lingering tension from the earlier encounter with Samantha. The calmness of the cabin had returned, but she knew this incident was far from over. There was something unsettling about how Samantha had treated her, the subtle mockery behind her polite but condescending words. Olivia was no stranger to people who judged her based on her appearance, but the way Samantha had acted felt like an intentional slight, one that was aimed at making Olivia feel out of place. She wasn't the type of person to let things slide, especially when it came to her worth and the way she was perceived. But for now, she had to remain composed. The rest of the flight was going smoothly, and soon they would be landing. Olivia had more important things to focus on, like the deals she needed to finalize upon landing. But her thoughts kept drifting back to Samantha. Round 2 hours into the flight, Olivia was engrossed in her work, typing up a few emails, when she was interrupted again. This time, it was a soft knock on the side of her seat. "Excuse me, Miss Barnes? Can I have a word?" It was Ryan, the younger flight attendant who had been serving in the cabin earlier. His demeanor was more professional than Samantha's, but there was an underlying discomfort in his voice. Olivia looked up, raising an eyebrow. "What is it, Ryan?" she asked, trying to keep her tone neutral. "I just wanted to check if everything's all right here. You seemed a bit uncomfortable earlier with some of the service," he said, shifting on his feet. "I want to make sure we're doing our job properly, Miss Barnes." Olivia leaned back in her seat, her eyes narrowing slightly. Ryan wasn't the issue, it was Samantha. However, Olivia appreciated Ryan's attempt at diffusing the situation. Even if he wasn't directly involved, she didn't want to create a scene. But she wasn't going to let this go without addressing it either. "I'm fine, Ryan," Olivia said, her voice calm but firm. "I'm just not used to being questioned so many times in such a short period. First the boarding pass at the gate, and now, again here. It's a little unnecessary, don't you think?" Ryan hesitated before nodding. "I understand. We've had some issues with new staff, and sometimes things get a bit miscommunicated," he said, choosing his words carefully. "I'll make sure Samantha understands the protocol better moving forward." Olivia didn't respond right away. She just looked at Ryan, trying to gauge whether he was being sincere. After a moment, she nodded slowly. "That would be appreciated," she said, her voice softening. Ryan gave her a respectful nod and turned to walk away. But just as he reached the L, Olivia heard another voice, a familiar one, cut through the cabin. "Excuse me, may I speak to you for a moment?" Olivia's stomach tightened as she recognized the voice. It was Samantha. Olivia glanced up to see Samantha standing just behind Ryan, her arms crossed in front of her, her posture defensive. Ryan hesitated, his gaze flicking between Olivia and Samantha, before he stepped aside. "Of course," Olivia replied, her tone cool but controlled. She had a sinking feeling in her stomach as Samantha approached, but she remained seated and composed, not wanting to give Samantha the satisfaction of seeing her flustered. "I wanted to apologize for earlier," Samantha began, her tone a little too rehearsed. "I didn't mean to make you feel uncomfortable or out of place. I was just following procedures." Olivia's gaze was unwavering. She could tell that Samantha wasn't truly apologizing. It was a forced gesture, done only because of the pressure of being called out by David and the other passengers. Olivia wasn't going to fall for the false apology. "I appreciate your words, but an apology needs to be backed up by understanding," Olivia said evenly. "It's not about procedures, Samantha. It's about respect. You made an assumption about me without any regard for who I am or my position. That's not acceptable in any professional setting, and certainly not here." Samantha's face flushed a deep red. "I didn't mean it that way," she stammered. But Olivia could tell she was starting to lose control of the conversation. Samantha's defense was crumbling, and Olivia was just getting started. "Actions speak louder than words," Olivia continued, her voice steady but firm. "You may not have intended to offend me, but that's not how it came across. And I'm not the only one who noticed. I'm sure the passengers around us did too." Samantha opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. She was clearly caught off guard by Olivia's calm, assertive approach. She had expected to be able to brush this incident under the rug, but Olivia wasn't going to let that happen. "You need to take responsibility for your actions," Olivia said, her voice unwavering. "If you want to apologize, do so properly. Understand the situation, not just the procedure." Samantha stood there for a moment, her lips pressed tightly together. She was visibly flustered, and for the first time, Olivia could see her realizing the gravity of what she had done. Olivia took a deep breath and let the silence hang in the air for a moment, allowing Samantha to process her words. But just as the moment seemed to stretch on, David's voice cut through the tension once more. "Is everything okay here?" David Thompson, the lawyer who had intervened earlier, stood up from his seat, his eyes immediately locking onto Samantha. He had been watching the exchange from his seat, and now, it seemed, he had come to offer further support. Samantha's eyes widened. She hadn't expected to be confronted once again. The passengers around them were watching intently, and now it seemed like the entire cabin was holding its breath, waiting for the next move. Yes, everything is fine," Samantha stammered, clearly trying to salvage the situation. She quickly turned to Olivia. "Again, I'm sorry, Miss Barnes. I will make sure it doesn't happen again." Olivia gave a small nod, But there was no mistaking the sense of power she now held. She had turned the situation around, asserting herself with grace and calm. Samantha had underestimated her, but now Olivia was in control. David, sensing that the situation had reached its climax, gave Olivia a reassuring look before returning to his seat. Olivia leaned back, allowing herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. She had handled the situation, not with anger or aggression, but with calm authority. Samantha had been called out, and Olivia had proven that no one, no matter their position, had the right to make her feel inferior. But as the fight continued, Olivia couldn't help but wonder if this was truly over. She had made her point, but she knew that people like Samantha didn't just back down easily. There would be consequences, but she would be ready for them. As Samantha approached Olivia's seat, her body language was stiff, almost defensive, as if preparing for a confrontation. Olivia, already aware of the underlying tension between them, sat back in her seat, her posture straight and composed. She wasn't going to let Samantha control the narrative this time. The flight had been relatively peaceful since their first exchange, but Olivia knew this situation wasn't going to let itself die down without some kind of resolution. She'd faced difficult people before, but there was something different about Samantha. The young flight attendant had, in Olivia's mind, crossed a line. Samantha stopped beside Olivia's seat and took a deep breath before speaking. "Miss Barnes, I just wanted to apologize again for earlier. I didn't mean to make you feel uncomfortable." Olivia tilted her head slightly, studying Samantha's face. She didn't see sincerity in her eyes, just the awkwardness of someone who had been caught in their own mistake. Samantha was only apologizing because she had no other option. The pressure from other passengers, including the lawyer who had spoken up, had forced her into this corner. Olivia wasn't about to make it easy for her. "I appreciate the apology, Samantha," Olivia said slowly, her voice calm yet firm. "But you need to understand something. It wasn't just about the procedures. It was about how you made me feel. You assumed things about me without any reason, and that's not acceptable." Samantha shifted on her feet, her hands clasped in front of her as she nervously glanced around the cabin. "I didn't mean to offend you, Miss Barnes. You questioned my presence in first class," Olivia cut in, her voice still steady. "You made me feel as if I didn't belong, and that's something I'm not willing to overlook." She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. The silence between them stretched for several moments. Olivia wasn't going to yell or shout at Samantha. That wasn't her style. Instead, she made sure her words were deliberate, each one landing with precision. She wanted Samantha to understand that this wasn't just a small mistake. It was an issue of respect, and that was something that couldn't be easily dismissed. "I've worked hard to be where I am," Olivia continued. "I've earned my place, and I don't take kindly to people questioning that, whether it's in a professional environment or a situation like this." Her eyes locked onto Samantha's, giving her no room to avoid the conversation. "You need to learn that your job isn't just about following the rules. It's about treating people with dignity." Samantha's expression was unreadable for a moment, her lips pressed tightly together. She clearly didn't know how to respond. Olivia's calm, assertive presence had thrown her off, and she was realizing too late that she had made a grave mistake. Samantha had misjudged Olivia, thinking she could easily intimidate her. But now it was clear who was in control. "I'm sorry," Samantha said softly, almost too quietly for Olivia to hear. "I will do better." Olivia nodded once, acknowledging the apology, but she knew that the damage had already been done. The passengers around them were still watching, and Olivia could feel their gaze on her. She wasn't going to let Samantha get away with the idea that this was just a minor issue. Not when it came to respect. Not when it came to how people like Samantha made others feel like they didn't belong. "You should," Olivia replied, her tone softer now, but with an underlying firmness. "But don't just apologize because you're in the wrong. Apologize because you understand why what you did was wrong." With that, Olivia leaned back in her seat, her gaze flickering to the front of the cabin. signaling the end of the conversation. She didn't need to say anything more. Samantha had been put in her place, and the message had been clear. Respect was something Olivia commanded, not something that could be taken lightly. As the flight continued, Olivia couldn't help but reflect on the power dynamics at play. She had handled the situation with grace, asserting herself without resorting to aggression. But what made her most proud wasn't the way she had dealt with Samantha. It was the realization that she had been able to maintain her composure and stand her ground in a difficult situation. In the past, Olivia might have let this go, brushing it off as a minor inconvenience. But this time was different. She wasn't going to allow someone's prejudice to define her. Not anymore. She had worked too hard to get to this point in her career, and she wasn't about to let anyone undermine that. As the plane began its descent, Olivia's thoughts shifted back to her business meetings ahead. She was almost at the end of her flight, and soon she would be on the ground, ready to tackle the challenges of the day. But as the plane touched down and began taxiing toward the gate, Olivia couldn't shake the feeling that there was still more to come. The passengers around her began to gather their belongings, preparing for arrival. But Olivia remained in her seat for a moment longer. She wasn't just another passenger on this flight. She was a woman with power, with influence, and she knew how to make her voice heard. As the seatbelt sign dinged off, Olivia stood up and gathered her things. She noticed Samantha walking down the aisle, her eyes briefly meeting Olivia's before she looked away. Olivia didn't respond. There was no need. Samantha had already been dealt with. Just as Olivia made her way toward the exit, she caught sight of a familiar figure, David Thompson, the lawyer. He was waiting near the jet bridge, looking as composed as ever. But there was a glint of something more in his eyes. Olivia approached him, giving him a nod of recognition. "Thank you for earlier," Olivia said, her voice sincere. "I appreciate you stepping in." David smiled, his expression warm, calculated. "You handled it well. I'm sure Samantha won't forget the lesson. People like her need to be called out when they overstep." Olivia nodded, her eyes briefly drifting toward the flight attendants, who were now gathered at the front of the plane. She could see the tension in the air, the unspoken understanding that things had changed. Samantha had been put in her place, but that wasn't the end of it. As Olivia walked past David, she caught the last glance of Samantha, who was standing near the galley, looking defeated. It wasn't just the way Olivia had stood up to her, it was the way the entire situation had unfolded. It was a lesson in humility for Samantha, a reminder that people in positions of power shouldn't assume they can treat others however they please. And as Olivia stepped off the plane and into the terminal, she knew that this wasn't just another business trip. This was a moment of personal growth, one that had reminded her of the power of composure, assertiveness, and, most importantly, respect. She had proven that no one had the right to make her feel less than she was, and she wasn't going to let anyone forget it. As the plane touched down and began taxiing toward the gate, Olivia could feel the tension that had been building throughout the flight slowly dissipating. Her encounter with Samantha had been uncomfortable, but Olivia had handled it with the poise and confidence that she had always relied on in the business world. She could sense, however, that this wouldn't be the end of the story. The entire situation had sparked a shift in her perspective. It wasn't just about defending herself in the moment, it was about the larger issue of respect, power dynamics, and how people who believed they held authority often misused it. Olivia stood up as the seatbelt sign was turned off, collecting her belongings and preparing to disembark. She noticed Samantha again, now at the front of the cabin, assisting passengers. Their eyes met briefly, but Olivia didn't acknowledge her. She had made her point. Samantha had been put in her place, and Olivia didn't need to add anything further. As she moved toward the exit, Olivia found herself walking alongside David, the lawyer who had helped her earlier. He gave her a small, knowing smile as they exchanged a few words. "You handled it well," David said. "I can't imagine Samantha will be making that mistake again anytime soon." Olivia chuckled softly, her eyes scanning the passengers who were gathering their things. "I hope not. She'll think twice next time." "I'm sure of it," David replied, his voice warm, but with a hint of seriousness. "People like her need to be called out, or they'll continue to treat others that way." Olivia nodded, grateful for his support earlier. "I couldn't have done it without you, David." "Thank you again." David gave her a respectful nod. "Glad I could help, but you were the one who took control of the situation. That's what matters." Olivia smiled and made her way through the jet bridge. As she walked toward the terminal, she felt a sense of quiet satisfaction settle over her. The whole ordeal had been a reminder of just how important it was to stand up for herself, especially in situations where people like Samantha, who assumed they could exert power over others, attempted to undermine her. Olivia had shown, with calm authority, that she would not tolerate such behavior. She knew the business world was often a battleground, where people tried to assert dominance in subtle and sometimes insidious ways. But Olivia had learned that true power wasn't about loud declarations or dominance. It was about knowing how to navigate situations with grace, confidence, and, most importantly, respect. As she stepped into the terminal and made her way to baggage claim, Olivia's phone buzzed. She pulled it out, expecting to see an update about one of her meetings. Instead, she saw a notification from a social media platform. Curious, she opened it, and what she saw made her pause. A video had been posted online, showing the moment when Samantha had questioned Olivia's boarding pass at the gate. It was a shaky, grainy recording taken by a passenger who had witnessed the exchange. In the video, Samantha could be heard making sarcastic remarks and questioning Olivia's presence in first class. The comments below the video were quickly filling up with outrage. The video had gone viral. The comments ranged from support for Olivia, who had handled the situation with grace, to condemnation of Samantha's behavior. People were calling out the blatant disrespect and prejudice that had been displayed, and some were even tagging the airline in their posts, demanding that they take action. Olivia stood there for a moment, letting the reality of what was unfolding sink in. She hadn't expected this, she hadn't wanted it. But now, the entire situation was playing out on a much larger scale, one that was beyond her control. She could feel the weight of the moment. While the incident had started as a small personal issue between her and Samantha, it had now turned into something much bigger. The video was spreading fast, and the airline was likely going to be forced to respond. Olivia quickly turned off her phone, slipping it back into her bag. She knew there was nothing more to be done. The situation had already played out in the public eye, and the fallout was inevitable. She had already made her peace with how she handled herself. If people wanted to make a spectacle out of it, there was little she could do to stop them. But as she made her way to the airport exit, Olivia couldn't help but feel a sense of empowerment. This entire situation had made her realize something important. There was power in composure. There was power in standing up for what was right, even in the face of adversity. And perhaps most importantly, there was power in letting the world see that people who acted like Samantha, who thought they could get away with mistreating others, wouldn't always have the last word. As Olivia stepped outside into the warm sunlight, she took a deep breath and smiled to herself. Whatever came next, she would face it with the same confidence and poise that had gotten her to this point in the first place. She wasn't just a businesswoman. She wasn't just someone who traveled in first class. Olivia Barnes was a woman who knew her worth, and she wasn't afraid to make sure the world knew it too.